Okay, I am going to show you how to do the stitching variables sample, which includes where we use different stitch lengths on the garment, and then I'm going to put a sleeve in for you. So the first thing that we had you do was to stay stitch, and we had you stay stitch the neck edge and the shoulder seams. And stay stitching, as you know, helps to stabilize curves and angles so that your fabric doesn't stretch out of shape while you're making your garment. So here is my stay stitching here on the neck in the front piece, or is that the back? That would be the front. Okay, this is the front because it's lower. And what you want to do is we stay stitch at regulation stitch length, and because this seam is a 5/8 of an inch seam, we always go in towards the raw edge into the seam allowance 1/8 of an inch before your seam line. That way it stabilizes the edge, but it can stay in there permanently. I don't have to take it out when I actually sew my seam. So that means it's 5/8 minus 1/8, go in towards the raw edge 1/8, and I'm at 1/2 inch. So here's my stay stitching at 1/2 inch, and I start at the shoulder seam and I go down and stop at center front. And as you can see, I've got my arrow here to indicate the direction I go. So make sure you put that on your sample so we know that you know which direction to go. Okay, and when we stitch with the grain. That means we stitch in the direction that these yarns will go back down towards the garment. That's with the grain. So on this side, again, I started at the shoulder seam and stitched down to the center back of the neck. And there's my arrow indicating the direction. If I sewed the other direction, can you see how it would then pull these yarns out of place and cause it to change shape and stretch? But when we sew, we want to sew where these yarns kind of go back and in towards the garment. Okay, now we're also going to stay stitch on the shoulder seam. I'm going to start again at the shoulder neck seam and stitch in the direction towards the shoulder sleeve seam, the top of the shoulder at the arm side there. And we have an arrow that points in that direction as well. And here's the arrow. And because it's a 5/8 seam allowance, I do it at 1/2. And I use regulation stitch length. And if you look at the direction that I'm stitching, when I stitch, it helps the yarns to go back into the garment. If I were to go the other way, then can you see how those yarns would be lifted up away from the garment? So that's kind of a clue. All right? So I've done my stay stitching, so I'm done with that. The next thing I'm going to do is ease-stitching. Okay, so ease-stitching is now, I'm going to do that on my sleeve. And I'm going to do it at the arm side from notch to notch. And when we ease-stitch, we use a little bit bigger stitch than regulation. So here I've got a 3mm stitch, which is a little bit bigger than our regulation, which is like 2.4, 2.5. So a regulation stitch is about 12 stitches per inch, 10 to 12, but my ease-stitching is more like 8 to 10. Okay? Now when I ease-stitch, I need to ease-stitch right close to my 5/8. What ease-stitching does is it condenses the yarns so that a little bit larger area can fit into a little bit smaller area. The sleeve has to come up over the shoulder, and it's an outward curve, so it's a little bit bigger. The arm side seam at the bodice is a little bit smaller because it hugs right close to where your arm joint is, where your arm joins your body. Okay, so there's my ease-stitching. All right, okay, now the next thing you're going to do is just regulation stitch length. Go ahead and sew the shoulder seam of the bodice front and the bodice back and the side seam. So we've got that done and they're pressed open. 5/8 regulation stitch length. Then I'm going to take my sleeve and I'm also going to sew this sleeve seam, and it's going to be 5/8 regulation, anchored on both ends, and I press it open. Okay, so now I've got the sleeve, which has been formed into kind of like a tube, and then I have the bodice, which has the opening here.